Well, hello everybody. How are we doing today? My name is Walker Goodemote. I'm the Interpretation and Communications Coordinator here. I know for our regular visitors, Jeff Ludwig is usually the one who does this, but he's out of town today, so I'm filling in. I'd like to welcome everyone to this lunchtime lecture at the Seward House Museum and Event Center here in our renovated barn. Yes, so we're very excited about this. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I want to just plug a couple upcoming events to make sure you know what's coming up here at Seward House Museum. First, our next lunchtime lecture will be the 26th of September. One of our board members, Shelley Clark, who wrote her doctoral dissertation on Frances Seward, will be discussing Frances's sister, Lizette Miller, who is an abolitionist and women's rights activist in her own right. So we're very excited to hear Shelley discuss Lizette. October is just as busy for us. Our lunchtime lecture in October is from our volunteer, Sam Tamburo, who will be discussing some research he's done on William Seward's quest for the presidency, the long, sort of through the 1850s up to the nominating convention. And that will be on the 2nd of October, which is a Thursday. Also in October, Tom Slaughter of the Seward Project, who for many years worked digitizing all of the Seward family's letters, will be discussing his new book about the Seward family. It's called The Sewards of New York. That'll be a paid book talk that'll be held at the Carriage House Theater here in town. That's at 6 p.m. on the 23rd of October. So very excited to hear the insights Tom has found about the members of 33 South Street. I was lucky enough to read one of the advanced copies, a lot of info about the family, the people who lived here, especially for our longtime community members. Any questions you might have about members of the family, the kids, Frances, a lot of those questions will be answered in this book. The last thing I wanted to plug is our first Friday. We have artists in our museum every first Friday, and the Barrow Gallery and Skinny Atlas will be displaying some of their wonderful art through the month of October. We're very excited about that, so please make sure to come out to see them and all our other events coming up. All right, with that out of the way, I want to introduce Dr. Ronald Butchart, who is a Professor Emeritus from the University, Distinguished Research Professor Emeritus from the University of Georgia. We're very excited to be having him here today. He'll be discussing his book, Schooling the Freed People, Teaching, Learning, and the Struggle for Black Emancipation. He's really going to dive into the story of the teachers who went down to the South after the close of the Civil War and taught the freed people down there, as well as the efforts the freed people made to educate themselves. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ronald Butchart.
Thank you, Walker, and I am aware that I am under the watchful eye of William Seward back in the back corner, so I will have to remain as honest as possible. Let's set the context. If you know anything about American slavery, we probably don't, any of us know as much as we should, but one of the constants, and it's true of almost any slavery society, you never let the slave become literate. A literate person does not make a good slave. There were exceptions to that. If you had a particularly, what you at least perceived to be a very loyal slave, you might provide a little bit of literacy so that they can become an amanuensis, or you can send them off to get some supplies and write it down rather than having them memorize it. But for the most part, by 1860, the 4 million slaves in the South are illiterate. As soon as the Civil War begins, the Union establishes lines in Northern Virginia, captures the Sea Islands of Georgia, and immediately an interesting thing happens. Of course, the slave owners had always spoken of their loyal slaves, that they appreciated the possibility of becoming civilized. The freed people gave the lie to that because they immediately fled the plantations to get across the lines to freedom. They emancipated themselves. And so imagine you are one of these people, you have been enslaved your entire life. You're now at least informally free. You're not legally free yet. The Emancipation Proclamation is still 3 years away. What do you need?
Food, shelter, a job.
You need a job, okay.
Food, shelter.
Food and shelter.
You need how to read.
Why do you need to know how to read?
Well, if you want to accomplish anything.
African Americans from 1620 on have constantly sought literacy. And so what you have scattered throughout the South from 1620 to 1860 are secret schools where a literate slave would meet with children, adults, often late at night, and try to pass literacy on. But even with that effort, of course, literacy is very limited. What's interesting is that as they come across the lines, they of course immediately seek food, they seek shelter, and then they demand literacy. Teach us. And if they had a black colleague who knew something, get together with that person, pass on what knowledge we have. So the very first schools to be established as open, not the clandestine schools, but as open, available schools, are not started by the white teachers I'm going to focus on mostly. They were started by African Americans, most of them taking the schools that they had taught secretly for 20 or 30 or 40 years and opening them up to the people who had freed themselves. So when historians, the first generation of historians back in the 1880s, 1890s, wrote the story of Reconstruction, they were all Southern white gentlemen historians, and they wrote a particular history that unfortunately I still find being taught in high school, that the war was caused by the abolitionists were foolish, that the abolitionists didn't understand African Americans, they understood African Americans. So that was the story they told was that, in fact, one of them, a fellow by the name of Edgar Knight, writing in 1935, said that the Northern teachers coming into the South destroyed the good relations between the Southern whites and Southern blacks. That would have come as a surprise to the Southern blacks, I'm certain. But the result was an overwhelming demand for literacy, which continues on beyond the end of the war, continues right through the 19th century. And so to fulfill this need, Northern groups, often led by abolitionists, would establish aid societies that I'll refer to from time to time. The New England Freedmen's Aid Society, the Pennsylvania Freedmen's Relief Society, the American Missionary Association, and they were raising money and recruiting young people to send into the South to become teachers. So the traditional narrative written by these white Southern historians, actually they follow a very important and interesting book by W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of the Black Folk, which if you haven't read it, you should. It's a wonderful book. And in that book, he says that the people who came south to teach the slaves were primarily New England schoolmarms that were coming down to provide literacy to the freed people. So they argued that they were single, that they were abolitionist, that they were motivated by a hatred of the South. They imply, one or two of them sort of say, that they were from relatively wealthy Northern families. and that they came south to punish the South and because they were homely and needed husbands. It's an interesting ad hominem argument that one of them makes, that the teachers were horse-faced, bespectacled school marms. Now, what one's face looks like to become a teacher should make no difference, but that was the argument in favor of this negative view. And it was interesting that as historians in the 1940s and 1950s began to revise that negative picture of Reconstruction, began to talk about the carpetbaggers as not bad people. Of course they were carpetbaggers. You had to have luggage to get to the South, and those were carpetbags. But that for the most part, the story of the North destroying the South through Reconstruction was a myth, or worse than a myth. If you had a school that were teaching a school in the South, you were in danger. If you were a male, you could very well be shot. Interestingly, women were a little bit safer because the South did have a tradition of chivalry, and you don't shoot women. You shoot at women to scare them, to frighten them off. But we know of hundreds of teachers who were in fact killed, lynched. But as the story of Reconstruction shifts in this more positive direction, they sort of ignore the teachers. They're really focused on the politics, what's going on in the legislatures, what's going on in the towns. But finally in 1980, and I actually have some show and tell. In 1980, 3 books were published almost simultaneously, curiously. One happens to be by a fellow by the name of Ronald Butchart, my first book, based on my dissertation that I wrote in Binghamton at the university there. The original, by the way, is 750 pages long. You do read this one. Simultaneously, my friend Jacqueline Jones wrote Soldiers of Light and Love. Notice the language. These are not horse-faced, bespectacled, South-hating people. They are soldiers of light and love. And she uses Georgia as her case study. Fine study. Robert Morris writes Reading, Writing, and Reconstruction, Education of the Freedmen in the South. What's interesting is that these 3 books really work well together. We don't repeat each other. We focus in different ways. My book really focuses on the aid societies. Who were those people? What was their vision? What were they shooting for? How much money did they raise? So in addition, I should add that in addition to the aid societies that are helping get teachers into the South, the government in 1865, right at the end of the war, created the Freedmen's Bureau, and I'll refer to it a few times. It was actually, the full name was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. So Freedmen is sort of part of 3 roles. The abandoned lands were the plantations that were owned by people who might have been killed in the war, but many of them, in fact, at the beginning of the war, and this is a story that is not well known, took their slaves, put them on ships, and went into the islands of the Caribbean or into Argentina and continued slavery in those places. But the 3 of us in our books written in 1980-81 revise the story only somewhat. We said yes, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, and as the other historians said, they were from New England, but we saw them as heroic women. They were single women. We emphasized the female part of the story. They were motivated by Christian concerns for the poor, and that their work was the Northern gift of schooling to the South. That was sort of the argument we made. Well, Historians are odd people. I'm an odd person. What we tend to do when we read a book is to turn to the back, and of course every book has its bibliography. And I'm a great reader of bibliographies. And I was teaching down at Cortland State for many years, and I was talking with my students about this changing view. And as I was talking to them, I thought, you know, it's interesting. I bet if I go back and look at the bibliography of my book, of Bob Morris's book, of Jackie Jones's book, I'll bet we all can't use the same sources and probably use the same sources that those Southern white historians 50 years ago, well, back then, so now 80 years ago. Time flies. I thought, no, okay, now we have a problem. If they used sources, papers from the Freedmen's Bureau, papers from the American Missionary Association, papers from the New England Freedmen's Aid Society, et cetera, and reached negative conclusions, and then these three young upstarts, I was young back in those days, we've come to a very different conclusion, and that's troubling because we all use the same sources and came to different conclusions. Does that mean that historical interpretation is just how you happen to be feeling that Saturday? Or did the three of us write these books with this perspective because we were young civil rights activists back in the 60s and 70s? So I thought to myself, I've got to go further to really figure out what's going on, who are these people, and why are they doing what they are doing. I need to find every single one I can find. I created a database, and yes, this works for me. Over the subsequent years, my wife, Amy Rolleri, sitting here, by the way, the president of the Barrow Gallery over in Skaneateles, we began looking, where did that nice little thing go? We created this database, and we looked everywhere we could. Come down here, there you go. Yeah, thank you, clear. Come clear to the bottom. Yeah. At any rate,
There's the P's, there's the P's, there's the R's.
thank you, Walker. This is
You're
great.
welcome.
Yes.
Good for something after all. Oh,
And if Walker ever reaches
see
the
how much there is.
if Walker ever reaches the bottom of that, you will see that we have been able to identify 11,000. My, this is.
Yeah.
It takes, we need, on the computer, we can just hit Control End and we're there.
Well, there are the W's.
There we go, there we go. Not quite, not quite. So in the course of about 20 years of work, what's that last number there?
11,944.
I always wanted to find those last few so that I could say I had 12,000, but I'm still looking for the last few. These are the people that we were able to identify that spent at least a year in a Southern black school between 1861 and 1870, by the end of Reconstruction, 1876. 11,900 and some odd. A lot of people. But then we could send, well, what does that tell us? That's a lot of people. But as we begin to analyze that, and by the way, we were looking for a number of things. To be included in our list, we needed to know their name, we needed to know where they taught, and what year they taught in. If we had those three things, they went in. And there are a number of these people, that's all we ever found. But beyond that, we tried to, of course, we've been easily identified, not easily, a couple of them we weren't sure because they were just a young blood. Who is a young blood? So we're looking for gender. We were looking for, now, Walker, I need to go back to the top. Is there a way to do that? Just boom, boom?
I think over here we can use, where's your little,
Yeah, I don't want to do it that way. I want to fly up. Where's,
just do this. No, that just makes it bigger. Well, that's something we should have tested before.
And now you've got race in the third.
right. So what is the race? And in many cases we don't know. White, black. In what year were they born? In what year did they die? Which turns out to be rather uninteresting. This simply is notes to Ron and his research assistants, including my lovely wife, as to where we found the material. If they were males, we wanted to know, did they serve, northern white males, did they serve in the military? This man did. These people apparently did not. If it's an N, it's a southern person. We wanted to know, oh, I wish I could reach the top very quickly. But for your sake, I pulled together all those I know who were from Cayuga County. So we were looking for race, honorary, in other words, is it Miss, is it Mrs., is it Mr., is it Reverend? The race, when they were born, when they died. Did we find them in the census? Census turned out to be a terrific way to find age, to find their occupations, their parents' occupations. The number, the relation, the religion, a lot of Quakers, an amazing number of Quakers, way over their proportion of the northern population. How many years between 61 and 77 did they teach? 1, 1, 13, 3, 2, 10. Antecedents, I was looking there, we began to realize that some of these teachers weren't northerners at all, they were southerners. Whoa, that was interesting. Well, could we find that they were slave owners? If that, so that's marked in that column, nothing here, none of those people. Or were they the children of slave owners? There's not much in that column. What were the parents' occupation? Of course, in the 19th century, the parents who were employed were usually men, the fathers. What position did they gain while they were in the South? In other words, did they become a principal? Were they a superintendent? What role besides teaching did they have? Were they abolitionists? Now that became an interesting question. What evidence do we have? Because that was so central to the argument made by the traditional historians. Can we find evidence that they were abolitionists? We have a lot of the letters written to the American Missionary Association, to all of the various agencies, to the Freedmen's Bureau. Many of those organizations were run by abolitionists, and yet most of the letters say nothing about having had any commitment to African Americans prior to going to the South, which we thought was quite interesting. I'll get to their motivations later. So if they were black, we assume if you're black, you were probably an abolitionist, so we didn't worry about that. If they were black, that was an automatic. What was their education? What do we know about their education? Their marital status. These 6 means they were married, 7 means they were a widow. Their occupation before they went to the South, their occupation afterwards, and of course, most of them were teachers. All of these 5s were teachers in the North. And then where did they go to school? For instance, Union Seminary, Oberlin College, there. And then between 1861 and 1877, in what years were they teaching? So This person is teaching for, the A is for the American Missionary Association, and that was the first place she taught, and the only place, as it turns out. F is the Freedmen's Association, the Quakers. There's a Quaker who ended up, and the total years here, in other words, we have the total years between 1861 and 1877, but some of them stayed on. And so we added those on, and this individual, make sure I'm getting the right one, Sarah Bowman, stayed in the South for 13 years. Her sister, also from Ledyard, was with her for 3 years. So this is the kind of material we were looking for. And then also, of course, their home. And then where was the first place they taught, the second place, the third place, the fourth place, the fifth place, the sixth place, and even for some people, the seventh place in the South where they taught. Some organizations were moving their teachers constantly. Every year they were showing up someplace different. Others would put you in Danville, Virginia, let's say, and support you there for as long as you stayed. So we had a pile of data that we began to analyze, and a number of things stand out. And what we were looking for are two different things. What is the profile of the group, the large group, and what can we deduce from their motivations, and how did that play out in the classroom? There were three groups that we identified. Northern white women that were the backbone of everyone else's writing, including our own, these three radicals writing in the 1980s. Certainly Northern white women were heavily represented, but they were only one group. And they were not primarily, interestingly, from New England. That was another argument that was made by both the revisionist historians writing in the 80s, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois and the earlier writers. Women outnumbered men 2 to 1 among those who go into the South. The men don't teach as long. The men who stay tend to be the ones who had become presidents of the early HBUCs, historically black colleges and universities. If they didn't get some kind of a role like that, they were gone, they were headed out of there. So that was the first group that popped out at us and didn't surprise us at all. The other thing about them was we found through the census and other sources that they didn't primarily come from privileged homes. They came from middling homes throughout the North. The second group really surprised us. And no one, not those of us writing back in the 80s, and no one writing about the Freedmen's teachers earlier, noticed the number of African Americans. 1/3 of the teachers were themselves black. A number of them are from the North. In the North, African Americans made up 2% of the population. They were 15% of the Northern teachers, which means they are showing up as teachers many times what their proportion of the population would suggest. And they stayed in the South, some of them for their entire lives. One quick example, and Walker and I were talking about this the other day. He became interested before he knew about my work. One of these teachers, a woman by the name of Edmonia Highgate, in the first graduating class of Syracuse High School, she graduated in 1860, I believe. She graduated with honors and taught in Binghamton, taught in Montrose, Pennsylvania before the war. As soon as the war broke out, she headed south and worked in Delaware for a year, then brought her sister and mother to Delaware established them in her school, and she headed on down to New Orleans. She was in New Orleans through the race riot of 1866, in which hundreds of Northerners and others and African Americans were killed. She escaped being killed and went off into the surrounding parishes and taught for a couple more years, then went back to New Orleans. Fascinating person. She eventually gets her entire family down there, absent her father, who was a barber in Syracuse and had died in 1862 of natural causes. Edmonia was a pistol. She spoke before the last meeting of the Massachusetts Abolitionist Society, putting itself out of business because there was no more need for abolitionism, they thought, in 1869. And she said at that time, if we don't do the right by the freedmen today, we're going to have to come back in 100 years and do it again. And I read that and thought, wow, she nailed it. 100 years later, we were right back in the South with Southern whites burning Greyhound buses and killing the Freedom Riders, and you know the rest of that story. So a large number of Northern blacks, a surprising number of them had college degrees. At the time, blacks were welcomed at Oberlin College, at Eleutherian College, at Oneida Institute, but they were also being admitted sort of on a one-by-one case at other colleges such as Dartmouth and Harvard and others. So a number of these Northern black men and women are extraordinarily well educated. The ones who hadn't had college education, we were able to at least establish they had what we would refer to as a common school education, which is what most Northern white teachers, even teaching in the North, would have had. They might have had gone to a normal school or just taken normal classes in high school. By the way, we call them normal schools because that's where you learn the norms of teaching. My students were always confused about why they call them normal schools. We don't do that anymore. But in addition to those African Americans, the Southern African Americans made up another big group of those who were teaching. Some of them very little education themselves. One of them, I love what this woman said. A white Union officer said to her, "Auntie," what whites tend to do to black women, "Auntie, you know that you're going to have to turn your students over to someone else when we get a chance." And she said, "I understand. I am not educated myself, but I can carry them a heap further than they already is." And that seems to have been the view of a lot of these Southern black teachers. I can take them a lot further than they are right now. I can at least give them some literacy, and then somebody else can pick it up and take it on from there. So the Southern black teachers came as a great surprise to us, came as a great surprise to my colleagues in the field of history of education. I gave 3 or 4 papers on them as we were doing this work, and my colleagues were sort of blown away by it all. And then the third group was particularly troublesome because they were the Southern white teachers. And who are these people? Well, it turns out a lot of them, the men, were teaching these classes wearing their Confederate uniforms. You saw the problem, didn't you? What are they shooting for? What are they trying to teach? Subservience, white supremacy, as opposed to what many of these white teachers are teaching. So we found that interesting. We went back and looked then at the Northern white teachers. What is their motivation? The motivation of these Southern whites seems to be to maintain the status quo as much as possible within the context of having lost the war. The Northern white teachers are writing to the organization saying, I want to teach because I want to be a servant in my master's vineyard. Okay. One fellow says, I want to go and teach among the freed people so that I can have more stars in my crown of rejoicing. Entirely self-referential. It's about me. It's not about, they never mention the freed people, other than say, I want to teach in a black school. It's a small group, about 200 of these women, that are really interesting. Every one of them in their letters or in other sources you can find were strong abolitionists. They're the people who stuck with it. The average white northerner taught for 2.5 years. And I say in the other book I brought with me, the one that I just finished, I guess this is my most recent book, 2010, Schooling the Freed People. That small group taught for years in the South, and most of them died in the South teaching their schools. Carolyn Putnam went down to Lottsburg, Virginia in 1869, established a school that she taught until she died 49 years later. Laura Town, 1862, goes into the Sea Islands of Georgia, brings her lifelong partner with her, Ellen Murray, and the two of them teach until both of them die after 47, 48 years of teaching. So motivation mattered. If you look at those who just said, I need to be a servant in my master's vineyard, well, being a servant, you can do that in a year, and that's good, and the master will reward you well, and you can go on your way. Many of them, curiously, would spend a year or two teaching. One fellow comes to mind, taught for 1 year in the South after having said that he needed to be of service to his master. Taught for 1 year and then came back to the North and became a warden at Sing Sing. He continued to be helping someone, and then left there and went to New York City and started an orphanage for the orphans of immigrant people. So wanting to be of service, wanting to be a servant in your master's vineyard didn't provide the impetus to stay with this work. That 200 that I mentioned are very interesting because they talk about teaching in a very different way. They talk about teaching toward democracy, toward intellectual emancipation, toward preparing teachers themselves who would go out and teach towards the same aim. They took the needs of an oppressed people as the point. This is what we're there for, and this is what we teach toward. So the question that we ask is, did it matter about motivation? It mattered incredibly that if you understood your work as being the work of intellectual emancipation of a people who have been oppressed for 250 years, you're going to stay with it. You're going to teach differently. When I say you're going to teach differently, Carolyn Putnam at Lottsville, Virginia is an interesting example. She talks about her teaching. Most of them, we don't know what they taught. Well, we know that they taught reading, writing, arithmetic. But they didn't talk about what they did in the classroom. When they wrote from the South, they're talking about having had dinner with Colonel so-and-so. We don't know much about it. Carolyn Putnam writes long letters about the way she teaches. A lot of the teachers would say, you know, one of the things that these people need to learn is punctuality. Think about it. These people didn't have clocks. They were being forced back into a form of peasantry where you don't need a clock, you just need to know the sun's up and you go out and you work. Carolyn Putnam didn't worry about punctuality. She said, I began teaching as soon as I have 4 or 5 people who are ready to learn, who show up at my door. She didn't worry about getting every child there as long as she understood that the children were getting what they could and then going home and teaching their brothers and sisters. She talks about one child who she'd noticed the children of one family. One child would come for 6 weeks and then be gone, and another child would show up for 6 weeks. And when she asked about it, it turns out they had 1 pair of shoes. So one child gets to put on the shoes and go to school and come home and teach his brothers and sisters, and then another child would put on the shoes and go to Carolyn Putnam. Her point was not to teach punctuality. Her point was to teach you to become a citizen, to think about your world, to think about what do we need and how do we get it when we are in a position of oppression. So that group of people are, what I refer to here, I refer to the entire group as the real heroes of Reconstruction, and I come away and say, well, I have revised myself. You've heard of historical revision. This is a revision of my earlier work. Say, it's much more complicated. It wasn't just that they were teachers who were either there for themselves or they were there for African Americans to say, how do we prepare these people for the broadest, best participation in oppressive society? How are we doing, Walker? Oh, not bad at all. Questions? Yes?
What proportion of the groups that you studied were in the 200? Like, how many women versus men versus black versus white?
It's interesting. Among the African American teachers, it's an almost equal gender division. And the amount of time they spend excuse me, I've got a little bit of Parkinson's. It dries my mouth out very quickly. So an almost equal number. Among the northern teachers, mostly women.
Were mostly women?
Right. In the South, mostly men. Interesting. Which says a lot about the social history, women's history of the North and the South at the time, because by the 1860s, northern women were moving out of the household, out of household production. And so going off and doing work was not at all uncommon for them. In the South, that was not true. They were still in the house. If you take the whole 11,900 and whatever, it's an almost even split between men and women. There's Northerners, mostly women. The others it's a much more mixed bag.
And how about with the 200 you said were the ones that stayed with it? What was the proportionality there?
All women.
All women? How about white?
So you get a number of men who do stay, but they're the ones who have become a president of Howard University or of name the school, name the black school. And they may stay there for 15 or 20 years. None stay for their entire lives, the way a lot of those 200 die in the school they established. Against great violent odds, as I said, because of Southern chivalry, you don't kill a woman, black or white, interestingly enough, but you do everything in the world you can do to scare them or to push them off the sidewalk if you run into them in the street, or to degrade them in some way. You don't kill them. You kill male teachers.
So the time frame you're looking at here is actually earlier than I would have expected. It's pre-Reconstruction.
Yeah.
What type I can't picture school being open to teach blacks prior to the end of the Civil War. What am I missing?
You're missing the, it's a good word, you're missing the demand from people fleeing slavery for education. So you go on to the Sea Islands. You have schools started in 1862. Laura Town and Ellen Murray start a school in 1862 and run it just like they would run a school in the North. Get kids together, we read, we talk about what we're reading, we spread our literacy, and the guns are, you can hear the cannons booming. They talk about this. As I was teaching today, I could hear the cannons cannonading the Confederate ships that were trying to get into Charleston Harbor. So yeah, a lot of schools that early, if we can go back to, okay, so here, this person would be A. Judson Wakefield. Has a school already going in 1861. He's from Boston. He's at Port Royal on the Sea Islands. Yes?
Who are these teachers compensated?
If you, most of the northerner teachers are going to be supported by one of the aid societies. You made $20 a year, $20 a month if you worked for the American Missionary Association. Even in 1861, that's not very much money. If you taught for the Episcopalians, you made 25. The pay, you didn't do this for the pay. But again, an interesting thing about a number of the northern black teachers is that they go to South with no guarantee of any kind of support. They just head off on their own and show up in Charleston, show up in Abbeville, North Carolina, South Carolina, show up in Macon, Georgia, and start teaching. And charge the children 10 cents a week. And we'll teach with no guarantee when you head south. Now, if you're an African American woman coming from Auburn, New York, we don't happen to have any blacks from Cuyahoga County, you're not wealthy. You're hoping that maybe you've got friends who are sending you a few dollars a month. It's like my father told me, he said, well, Ron, if you want to go to college, I can guarantee I'll send you $1 a month. Well, I made it through a PhD on that. In fact, he quit sending me $1 a month after I finished my bachelor's, come to think of it. So I was on my own from then on. Yes?
My local hero is Emily Howland.
Yes.
From Sherwood.
Yes.
And she started multiple schools in the South.
Right. So it's
wealthy
not just teaching, but also starting other schools.
Kept starting
Right.
schools. And yeah, Emily. And just within the last few years, finally, she got inducted into the Women's Hall of Fame, the National Women's Hall of Fame. So if anyone wants to know more about her, just go over to
Right.
Medical Falls. And she did so much good. And she was from right here.
Yeah. Right.
So
Yeah. This is not
I
just.
love reading about her and her experiences.
Yeah, she teaches for 4 years for the American Missionary Association in Washington, D.C. She was from Sherwood, New York. Quaker. The Quakers are really, to my sense, the most overlooked heroic people in American history. What Quakers have done is simply astounding. If I weren't probably an atheist at heart, I'd probably be a Quaker. They were wonderful, amazing people.
After the war, there were many blacks in the state legislature.
Yes, indeed there were.
Now, is there a relationship between this education, or do they come from businesses or both?
Many of those legislators had taught before they went into the legislature, or after they left the legislature, or had taught, went into the legislature, and then went back to teaching. Judy.
Breakdown by state. Like, do you know the number of teachers in North Carolina, for instance?
It'd be very easy to calculate it. I couldn't give you the numbers right now, but that's the nice thing about having used this format. I can simply say, give me everyone from New York, and boom, I'll have a...
Where they taught in the South.
Oh, yeah, I can do that also, because you see see that F5, what that means is a Quaker school, number 5, which is in Warrenton, North Carolina. So you can kind of, if you read this, you can figure out where they taught, when they were teaching there. And
The reason I'm asking, my grandfather came from North Carolina in 1865 at the end of the war.
how old was he then?
He was 17 years old.
Uh-huh.
He could read and write. That's why I'm asking.
So he was already literate in 1865. It'd be interesting to know whether he got his literacy.
I don't know. He was from New Bern. So that's why I'm curious.
Right, and in New Bern, several schools were started in New Bern just as soon as it was interesting, the teachers were following right behind the Army. And as soon as you freed a portion of North Carolina, a school would show up. And what we learn if we go really look at this whole issue is that the black education in the South was not a gift of Northerners to the South. It was a gift of the freed people. They made sure that the South ended up with a public school system, which it did not have prior to that. But it set the foundations, even though following that, they will be put in the most inferior schools possible. They will not be supported, but it's the gift of the black community to the South.
I think within the last year, the Atlantic actually had an article about the establishment of public schools in the South, and really indicated that most of that were free black people established it, that in the South there really weren't public schools, and that it actually established the whole culture
Yes.
of public schools. And that
Absolutely.
without Northern intervention. They might have gotten Northern resources, but that, and it's within the last year, it was very interesting and very enlightening. I had no idea about that.
Yeah.
I'll piggyback on that. The resources, did the North, did the government, I know the government was a mess at that point in time, but did
What's new?
sponsor programs? I know in the Seward House, there are some books that were published at one time that they thought was going to be the all of education. Were there resources like that were provided by the government?
The federal government, as I said, in 1865 created the Freedmen's Bureau, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. By legislation, by the language of that legislation, the Freedmen's Bureau was not allowed to pay salaries, but it was a fairly important agency in at least establishing schools, and because of its relationship to the federal government, it was able to get, for instance, barracks that had been built for the Union forces. They could take them apart and move them and have the materials to build a schoolhouse. If you actually, and it's something that I don't, maybe a graduate student someday will be able to figure out how to do this. The one thing we have not really been able to figure out is exactly how much money came from what groups. We think, I think from my work, that the northern agencies, the various Freedmen aid societies, raised in voluntary contributions probably close to $7 million. The Freedmen's Bureau was funded for about $7 million. But then when you say, well, now how did this black school on this particular lot, where did the money come from that? It turns out that the freed people were told, if you want a school, you have to give us, white folks, you have to give us a lot upon which you are going to build the school, and you've got to build the school, and then we'll let you have the school there. But the land then belongs to the state. So we know of literally thousands of schools that were started in that way, out of grinding poverty, to come up with the money to buy a 1-acre lot to place a school, because we need to know. The letters from the black students are heartbreaking. But they talk about, we're free, but we're not really free. But we still need to know, how do things work? And how do we know that? We read. And so one of the things that when I was at the University of Georgia, which the last place I ever thought I would find myself teaching, turns out now to be a very interesting school where you see black men and white women dating. The relationships are really quite sweet. Given the most recent things from our current administration, I hate to think what's going to be happening there and elsewhere.
Maybe we can take one more question for Dr. Butchart.
I just wanted to say thank you for your comments about the teachers who stuck with it and who talked about their teaching. I'm a teacher outside of Boston in a small city, and I feel like we're still in that fight. And it's really inspiring to hear women 150 years ago, really articulating that and sort of giving us strength, I think, today.
Absolutely. Amy and I refer to our teachers, which is really unfair. They're not our teachers. But there is one woman who stood out to me, at least, who talks about, in my teaching, I have to help assure legal justice, but more important than that, I must help establish social justice. It's the first time in the 19th century I've ever seen anyone use the language of social justice, which I used to try to get my undergraduates to think about. Can you imagine what it means to teach towards social justice? And of course, they haven't got a clue.
And what a wonderful sentence.